The streets of Liverpool in the late 19th century were no strangers to hardship. Rows of brick houses pressed against each other like weary souls, the fog curling through the alleys with the damp weight of coal smoke and the bitter stench of the docks. It was a place where fortunes could rise overnight in the shipping trade, but more often, lives withered quietly under the boot of poverty and the sharp edge of betrayal. Out of that world stepped two sisters whose names would one day stain the whispers of the city, women who discovered that revenge did not always need a knife or a gun. Sometimes it came in a teacup, sweetened with sugar and stirred with poison. Catherine and Mary Holbrook had been born into a house that knew more grief than joy. Their father, a dock laborer, drank away what little wages he earned, and their mother's back bent under the weight of scrubbing, sewing, and nursing to keep the family alive. From the very beginning, the sisters understood that Liverpool was no place for delicate hearts. Their bond grew from necessity. Two girls pressed together against the world, each the other's only ally when the streets grew cruel. Yet what hardened them most was the betrayal of men. Catherine had been married young to a butcher who promised her stability, only to deliver fists and broken promises. Mary's sweetheart swore fidelity before turning to another woman when her dowry proved meager. In those wounds the sisters planted their first seeds of vengeance, small and silent, waiting for the day to bloom. Liverpool was alive with the clamor of ships, the rhythm of trade, the endless movement of men looking to fill their pockets or their glasses. The Holbrook sisters learned quickly that men had appetites stronger than their caution. They also learned that a woman who listened could earn trust, and a woman who smiled could disarm suspicion. Catherine was the quieter of the two, with watchful eyes and a patience that unnerved those who lingered too long in her company. Mary, on the other hand, had laughter like a bell and a charm that drew men as moths to flame. Together, they were a snare disguised as companionship. It began almost innocently, or so they told themselves. Catherine's husband had fallen ill one damp winter, his stomach racked with pain that no doctor could soothe. Neighbors shook their heads at the tragedy of it, whispering about spoiled meat or bad ale. No one looked closely at the small vials Mary fetched from the apothecary. No one noticed the bitterness hidden in his nightly broth. By spring, the butcher was in the ground, and Catherine, dressed in mourning black, inherited his modest savings. She wore her veil with solemn grace, but beneath it, her lips curled in satisfaction. It was not grief that gripped her, it was release. Word of their misfortune spread, but in Liverpool, tragedy was common enough to be unremarkable. Men still came, drawn by Mary's laughter, comforted by Catherine's quiet understanding. They found in the sisters what they longed for: companionship, warmth, and the illusion of trust. One by one, they shared meals and drink, never knowing that every swallow might carry the shadow of death. The sisters were careful, never rushing their designs. A pinch here, a dose there, until the poison did its work slowly, invisibly, and the men slipped away into graves with their pockets a little lighter, their fortunes a little smaller, now resting in the sisters' hands. The city began to murmur. Too many men had found their end in the company of the Holbrook women, too many funerals marked by their black-clad figures standing side by side, unshaken by grief. Some said it was bad luck, others whispered of curses, but none dared speak aloud what many suspected, that Liverpool had bred its own black widows. The apothecaries grew wary when the sisters came for arsenic under the pretense of killing rats. Still, they found ways to procure it, sometimes through bribery, sometimes through charm. Men continued to fall into their snare, blinded by desire, deaf to warning. Their vengeance was not random, nor purely for wealth. Each man chosen bore some cruelty, some betrayal, some echo of the wounds carved into the sisters' past. A drunkard who had beaten his wife until her ribs cracked. A dock foreman who pocketed wages while his workers starved. A solicitor who had seduced and abandoned a young girl, leaving her to ruin. In each case, Catherine and Mary saw a reflection of their own scars, and in their eyes, justice was a cup of tea sweetened with arsenic. They became executioners cloaked in petticoats, their judgments carried out behind closed doors with neither trial nor mercy. Yet revenge has a way of leaving traces, and even the clever grow careless when emboldened by success. It was the death of a young sailor, full of life and newly returned from sea, that stirred suspicion. His shipmates swore he had been strong and healthy, but within days of visiting the Holbrook house, he lay pale and gasping, his breath rattling like wind through a broken window. When he died, the doctor frowned at the blackened hue of his stomach and the strange stiffness of his limbs. Whispers became louder, and the authorities, pressed by frightened neighbors, began to watch the sisters more closely. Still, Catherine and Mary walked the streets with calm defiance, their veils brushing their cheeks, their hands folded in composure. They did not shrink from the suspicion. They wore it like armor, daring anyone to accuse them openly. After all, who would believe that women, soft-spoken, charming, devoted sisters, could wield such ruthless malice? Society had long underestimated women, and the Holbrooks wielded that underestimation as their sharpest blade. But poison is a patient enemy, and just as they had wielded it against others, it turned against them in the form of evidence that refused to stay buried. A chemist, recalling Mary's frequent visits, spoke of her repeated purchases. A doctor, examining exhumed remains, noted the unmistakable signs of arsenic. The pieces began to align, and the Black Widows of Liverpool found themselves ensnared in the very web they had spun for years. Whether they confessed or denied, the records remain unclear. What end they met is tangled in rumor. Some say prison walls swallowed them whole. Others claim they vanished into the smoke of the docks, never seen again. What lingered, however, was the legend. Mothers warned their sons of the Holbrook sisters, men muttered about poisoned kisses, and Liverpool carried their names in hushed tones long after their footsteps faded. The sisters had carved their revenge not with knives but with patience, with subtlety, with the power of a smile hiding death in its curve. They became specters of justice twisted into vengeance, reminders that even in a world built by men, two women could bend fate with nothing more than a vial of poison and the bond of sisterhood. And so the story of the Black Widows of Liverpool settled into the bones of the city, dark and enduring, like poison in the blood. The tale of Catherine and Mary did not end neatly with suspicion and whispers. For years afterward, Liverpool itself seemed to carry their shadow in its narrow lanes and damp taverns. Every sudden death of a man in the company of a woman brought their story back into circulation, each rumor woven with more dread than the last. It was as if the sisters had become more than flesh and blood. They were symbols of quiet vengeance, avatars of every wronged woman who had no recourse in a world ruled by men. After the death of the sailor, the authorities redoubled their efforts. Neighbors, once wary of speaking out, now came forward. A landlady told of hearing men groaning in the Holbrooks' house late at night, their voices pleading before being swallowed by silence. A grocer recalled Catherine buying sugar in unusual quantities, while another apothecary admitted, reluctantly, that Mary's cheerful chatter had distracted him enough times to disguise her repeated purchases of arsenic. The evidence mounted not in single blows, but in a slow accumulation, like water dripping steadily through stone until it left a hollow. But Catherine and Mary, far from cowering, seemed to thrive on the suspicion. They hosted tea for neighbors, served sweets to curious visitors, and walked boldly through the market with black shawls draped around their shoulders. Their eyes, sharp and watchful, carried an almost mocking light, as though daring the city to prove what it already feared. Some swore the sisters gained a perverse thrill from being the subject of gossip, that each sidelong glance in the street only deepened their sense of power. For beneath all their charm lay an undeniable truth. They believed themselves justified. In every man they poisoned, they saw echoes of their father's drunken cruelty, their lovers' betrayals, their husbands' fists, and the countless indignities endured by women without voice or protection. To the sisters, their actions were not crimes but retribution, carefully measured doses of justice delivered in silence. They never saw themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as restorers of balance in a world that had been tilted against them since birth. And yet, the machinery of the law was grinding closer. By 1890, investigators had grown bold enough to exhume several bodies. The discoveries were damning: stomach linings corroded, tissue blackened, the unmistakable traces of arsenic lingering even in the bones. Though poison was not uncommon in Victorian England, used in rat-killing powders and cleaning agents, so many deaths traced back to one pair of sisters could no longer be ignored. The trial, when it came, drew crowds that filled the courthouse and spilled into the streets. Men leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear the details of these mysterious women who could kill with a smile. Women, half horrified and half fascinated, whispered to one another about the courage it must take to defy the men who ruled their lives. Catherine, veiled in black, carried herself with cold composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mary, ever the performer, met the stares of the crowd with a faint smile, as if the trial itself were a stage upon which she would deliver her final act. The evidence was overwhelming: bottles hidden beneath floorboards, testimony from chemists, remains that told the same story again and again. Yet even as the verdict loomed, the sisters refused to break. They offered no tears, no apologies, no pleas for mercy. Instead, they sat together as they always had, shoulder to shoulder, their bond unshaken. What happened after the gavel fell is where history blurs with legend. Some records claim they were sentenced to life imprisonment, their days spent in the gray silence of stone walls until their bodies gave out. Others suggest they were hanged, their final moments spent hand in hand, facing the noose with the same unflinching defiance that marked their lives. And then there are those who insist the sisters escaped, vanishing into the smoke of the docks with forged papers and new names, leaving Liverpool to stew in the mystery of whether the Black Widows still walked among them. What is certain is the legacy they left behind. Their story became a cautionary tale whispered in taverns, a ghost story told to reckless men who courted women too carelessly. They entered the folklore of the city, figures both feared and admired, embodiments of a dark kind of justice. For years afterward, when a man died suddenly after a night of drink, his companions would murmur, "The widows have had him," as though Catherine and Mary's spirits still haunted Liverpool, ladling out vengeance where it was due. And perhaps that is where their true revenge lay, not only in the lives they claimed, but in the fear they planted, the way their names lingered long after their faces had vanished. The Black Widows of Liverpool became immortal in whispers, a legend steeped in poison, revenge, and the unbreakable bond of two sisters who chose to strike back at a world that had struck them first.